actually went to
Good morning and welcome to the Public Safety and Justice Subcommittee. I'd like to call the meeting to order at 9:33 a.m. Our first business is to approve minutes of the meeting. Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve the meetings.
Thank you. And a second?
Second.
Thank you so much. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. And any opposed? Okay, the motion carries 3-0. Our next item is to the reappointments of municipal court judges. This morning we have with us Judge Taylor to introduce the item.
Madam Chair, members, good morning. It's my pleasure to be here. As you know, the judges of the municipal court are appointed by the council for 4-year terms. We have a group of 7 judges here for you this morning whose appointments at the end of those 4-year terms are coming due in December and January. The Judicial Selection Advisory Board has met to consider and interview each of these candidates. And that body has unanimously recommended to the council that each of them be reappointed. So I'm just here to introduce that, and then, Madam Chair, at your pleasure, each of the 7 are here for an interview.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Judge Taylor, for being with us this morning. Before we proceed with the interview process for the 7 judges, I would like to request the subcommittee members to meet in executive session for a few minutes to discuss the process before we proceed. So
Madam Chair, before we do that, can we have David Benton from the Law Department read the required paragraph?
Yes, ma'am.
Microphone. Oh, thank you very much. Madam Chair, I don't have the exact words of the paragraph today, but it's just to advise everybody that we're about to go in executive session, and it's precisely what that means. To the extent that we go in executive session, somebody has to make a motion and make a motion to go in executive session. Anyone can make that motion. Also, with regards to public comment, if there's anybody who has public comment, it's limited to what we're going to be talking about that's on the agenda. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Benton. Do I have a motion to go into executive session?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. So we will go into an executive session shortly, and then we will be back out. Okay, welcome back to the Public Safety and Justice Committee. We will resume with item 2, the judicial reappointments. Do Councilman Waring, would you like to ask your question or make the motion?
Yes, question for Judge Taylor. Obviously we have the documents about the performance of the judges and so forth, but am I correct in saying if the judges, were not performing in terms of keeping up with their caseload, or they had a lot of citizen complaints or something like that, they wouldn't be appearing in our subcommittee today? Is that a fair statement? Or certainly they wouldn't with you asking us to do what you're asking us to do.
Madam Chair, Councilman Waring, you're essentially correct. I would be here with a different recommendation. My recommendation today is full-throated support for the recommendations that were made unanimously by the Judicial Selection Advisory Board and for the reappointment of all 7 of these judges.
So the board and yourself all took a look at it. Nobody had any concerns about these names that we're looking at. In light of that, Madam Chair, I would suggest just making a motion.
Please go ahead, Councilman Waring.
Thank you. I move to reappoint Judge Manyet Nyquist, Judge Thomas Paris-Gandola, and Judge Anna Sanchez, each as judge for a 4-year term that would end on December 19th, 2025. Judge Patricia George as judge for a 4-year term that would end January 1st, 2026. And Judge Marianne Bayardi and Judge Hercules Dellis and Judge Frankie Jones, each as judge for a 4-year term that would end on January 17th, 2026.
Do we have a second?
Yep.
Was there a second?
Yes, there was.
Thank you so much, Vice Mayor. So we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, please say nay. Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. Congratulations to all of our reappointed judges. Thank you, Judge Taylor, for being with us this morning. So we will move on to our next item, which is downtown security camera replacement. This is for discussion and action. And with us today, we have, I believe, Assistant Chief Sean Kennedy and Commander Brian Lee.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. As you stated, I'm Assistant Chief Sean Kennedy. I'm here with Commander Brian Lee, who is Commander of our Homeland Defense Bureau. We're going to provide you an update on the current status of the downtown camera system and what improvements need to be made going forward.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, Vice Mayor, and members of the subcommittee. So this discussion is on the replacement and the redesign of the security camera system in the city's downtown core. That area has been defined as 7th Street to 7th Avenue, Jackson Street to the I-10 freeway. At this point right now, we are looking at replacing cameras to improve the critical infrastructure, deterrence, and detection abilities and capabilities of those cameras in the downtown area, as well as increase the prevention and protection for event security for events that happen within the downtown core. Bye. Trying to advance the PowerPoint here. There we go. Okay, again, this is the defined downtown core and the boundaries for that. And this is done in preparation for the upcoming Super Bowl scheduled to occur February 12th, 2023, as well as other large-scale events taking place beyond that for the foreseeable future within the downtown area. Again, this project is scalable, and it will be implemented in phases. And the cost of Phase 1 is expected to be approximately $600,000, with a total cost for the project of approximately $1.6 million. A little bit of background history on the camera system. Between the years of 2008 and 2012, the Homeland Defense Bureau's Threat Mitigation Unit began incrementally building a capability for cameras in the downtown core. Funding at that time was provided using the Urban Area Security Initiative funds, which provided limited funding annually for the cameras to be purchased and installed. Post-2012, the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA changed the grant guidance, which made it no longer acceptable for agencies to install cameras or any other type of equipment unless there was a regional application and benefit to the remainder of the other agencies that were participating in the UASI. This meant that we could no longer purchase permanently mounted cameras in the downtown core. So between the 2008 and 2012, there were approximately 60 cameras, give or take, that were installed by the Homeland Defense Bureau Threat Mitigation Unit within the downtown area. Again, the funding did not allow for any upgrades or maintenance or replacement of any of the equipment. It only allowed for the initial purchase. Currently, as we sit today, only about 25 of those cameras are still permanently mounted and in varying states of operational condition within the city's downtown core. Some of you may have seen this image before. This is essentially what we are preparing to manage from a public safety standpoint. For those of you that may have seen this, if you recall, this was the Saturday night concert event series that took place Saturday, January 31st of 2015. This was the night before the Super Bowl, and this photo was actually taken by our air support unit overhead. But as you can see, we were managing approximately 100,000 people over a one square block area. This is a sample image showing the current quality of the camera video or camera footage that we can get from one of our permanently mounted cameras on the Jefferson Street garage. As you can see, it's very poor quality, very cloudy, and it's extremely difficult to obtain or describe any key identifiers for public safety if we were looking for anything specific. This is a sample page of what we see, what our threat mitigation unit sees when they try to access the cameras that are no longer operational. This is the camera image for the Superior Court building on 3 sections of that building that are no longer functioning and need to be replaced. This is another sample image of the permanent camera that's mounted on the Adams Street garage. As you can see, there's very poor camera quality, poor low light visibility. We're unable, again, to obtain any key identifiers from any of the images, and it's all based on the aging technology. By comparison, this is what we get in terms of the quality and image clarity from the current cameras that the Homeland Defense Bureau is utilizing, and these are on the deployable cameras that still can be purchased through UASI funding. These are off one of the cameras that was mounted in the downtown area in support of an event that was taking place, and these cameras are used throughout the region in order to support UASI events. This is utilizing the current technology, and again, it provides for optimal image quality and clarity. So again, we mentioned this could be done in phases. The first phase would involve these areas. It would include the replacement of 33 of the Homeland Defense Bureau cameras that are either no longer functional or in need of updates and repair. It would also include the IT infrastructure, which includes the servers and the storage necessary to store the video imagery. And then the third component is installing the wireless cameras and the wireless transmission systems that are necessary to allow for remote viewing in either an emergency operations center or a tactical operations center. There's also a recurring annual expense of $4,500, which is to cover the cost of the video management software licensing under the Milestone system that the city currently uses as its standard. So the cost summary, essentially, all 3 of these components have to be assembled in order to complete the network for any of the cameras. So by breaking that $600,000 into thirds, this is a rough estimate of what the funding would be used for and how it would be supported for each of the 3 components. The intent of this project is to start from the center of the downtown core, replacing those cameras that have already been identified, and expand outwardly throughout the defined geographic area of the downtown. And again, this project is scalable so that we can meet the needs of the downtown sector. And again, it's ever-changing skyline with all the construction that we continue to experience now and moving forward. The initial financial impact, again, the phase one is $600,000. Those funds have been identified in the department budget. Again, we spoke about the annual recurring cost of $4,500 for the video management software licensing, with a total projected cost of $1.6 million. It is possible these costs could increase due to the ability of the contract vendors, the product availability, and some of the challenges we continue to experience with supply chain logistics and the supply chain management for other ongoing projects. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions at this time.
Madam Chair, I have a couple questions.
Councilman Waring.
Thank you for the presentation. So I think my math is right. So there were 60 original cameras from 2008, and only 25 of those are still operational. So you're down 35, you got 35 inoperative cameras. You're replacing 33 of those. So you'd still be down 2 from the original 60 from 2008. But then you're adding 15 new ones. So you're really adding 13 cameras. How did you pick those 13 locations?
So our threat mitigation unit worked with the city's IT department and Public Works and the network team who helps us gain access to the city's network for the camera transmission. And again, some of those cameras are mounted in key locations because we utilize what's called a point-to-point rad-wind system, which allows us to shoot a beam directly through line of sight. And based on the geographic topography of the downtown area, they had to identify those locations where they could get that direct line of sight. So they are in the process of still mapping out, as well as looking to replace the cameras that are already in place and have been identified because either they're beyond end of life, or we can't get parts to replace them, or as you saw, some of the cameras that are just simply no longer functional.
So I assume, and this is an assumption on my part, so correct me if I'm wrong, the goal would be if somebody does something at the Super Bowl party or the concert or some other time in downtown, but we'll stick with your Super Bowl example, then they would be sort of trackable across at least a large swath of downtown. Is that how the cameras are placed?
Councilman Waring, yes, that is possible depending on where the cameras are placed and depending on the path of whether it be vehicles or individuals. We are looking to identify locations that will give us the broadest coverage to give us the most usefulness out of the locations that were picked from a public safety management standpoint.
I mean, with the cameras, like if that's not the goal, then I guess I'm wondering exactly what the goal is, because people would be monitoring these and you'd be looking at, you showed the picture of the Super Bowl, you'd have thousands of people. So the idea that you'd be identifying a pickpocket or something that doesn't seem realistic, given what the camera would be taking in or our capacity to immediately respond to what's on the camera and have somebody there to address it. So sadly, I think the cameras, unless I'm wrong, would be most useful if there is an incident to identify there's an incident going on, it's big, and then trying to actually catch the perpetrator, sadly, after the fact. So see something terrible or try to do something terrible, hopefully it's prevented. I mean, otherwise, what real utility is the camera? If there's a riot, you're going to know because you're going to have officers out on the street, right? I mean, so that's not going to be a surprise. You don't need a camera to really tell you that. It might be helpful in crowd control or something. But can you see what I'm saying? I'm kind of curious, like, what are we accomplishing here if it's not what I said originally?
Councilman Waring, no, I understand your question. And so actually with the placement of the cameras, we seek to put the cameras in areas that will help facilitate both ingress, egress for vehicular and pedestrian traffic flow to large venues that are situated within the downtown. We also look to place cameras that will give us coverage of buildings that are considered critical infrastructure for the city of Phoenix. So our federal courthouses, our city hall, buildings like that. Things that we do continue to look for during event management would be large gatherings of individuals where there may be a potential for something to happen if we start to see vehicles trying to gain access to areas that are restricted. Those are the types of things that from an event management side we are looking at to try to protect against or deter vehicles and or people who have malicious intent from gaining access to certain areas.
So if it was the courthouse and you saw somebody leave a backpack and then just walk away from the backpack or something rather strangely, is that the kind of thing we're talking about? And people are going to be, your cameras are going to be able to zoom in enough that that's clear in a swath of people, even day-to-day activity. If you walk around downtown, there's quite a bit of foot traffic, at least during the day. I mean, is that what we're talking about? And with the ingress and egress, this won't be the first big event that Phoenix has had. There are traffic patterns and, obviously lots of ball games and so forth. So do you need the cameras to do that? I don't know. Don't you already kind of know about what routes are best? I'm not trying to give you guys a hard time. I'm just trying to figure out what we're doing here because it's not cheap.
No, Councilman Waring, no, I understand. It's where we have seen success utilizing the limited camera coverage that we have now in managing some of these large events. From an emergency management standpoint and from an incident commander standpoint, it allows us the best opportunity to use these cameras as force multipliers, so we have multiple eyes in areas that we don't necessarily have personnel that are stationed at. What that allows us to do is to make quicker, more accurate, and timely deployments of personnel and resources to those affected areas, again, with the intent to remain ahead of an incident from occurring, and if not, to have resources there as quickly as possible to mitigate whatever the incident might be.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Waring. Councilwoman Ansari?
Questions? I'm good. Thank you.
Oh, okay, you're good. Vice Mayor Garcia?
I have a couple of questions. It's actually a series of questions. If it's easier, I'll ask a couple and then go to the next one. The first series would be who has access to the footage? Is the footage monitored at all times by someone, or is it simply stored and then looked at when it's requested? And if so, how long do we store the footage? Where is this footage stored? And the last question in this series is who has the right or ability to request any footage from cameras?
Mr. Vice Mayor and members of subcommittee. So a couple of pieces in that. As far as who has access to the cameras, the Central Monitoring Station, which is part of the City of Phoenix Police Department's Infrastructure Protection Unit, currently has folks who monitor the ongoing cameras that are running continuously in the downtown location here for some of those critical infrastructure locations I had previously mentioned. In addition, when we increase camera coverage for events, or if we have additional cameras that are able to be mounted permanently in these locations, it does provide an enhanced layer of coverage for us to be able to have visual sight of some of these other locations where we expect there will be large amounts of either pedestrian or vehicle traffic. As far as the storage goes, those cameras, the ones that are mounted that are continually running in the common areas of the downtown or mounted off the side of buildings, those are the video storage is retained for 30 days, and then after that the system purges and it continues to continuously store 30 days worth of coverage. Should there be an event or an incident that occurs and we're able to go back and review footage to see if we have anything that was captured, if it's evidentiary in nature, then we have our digital forensic imaging unit that will come out and actually download the video and impound it as evidence immediately following the event as part of an ongoing investigation should that occur. So as far as the people that have access to the cameras, it would be our central monitoring station employees that can see that and manipulate the pan, tilt, zoom options on the camera. or if we're managing a specific event or an incident in the downtown area, our threat mitigation unit has access to those cameras and can actually pull up the video footage and see it either remotely or from an emergency operations center.
Okay, couple of technical questions. Do the cameras we have now or the cameras we will get in the future have facial recognition technology? And do they have microphones?
Mr. Vice Mayor, the cameras that we currently are purchasing now, they do increase in terms of their clarity and the quality of the image, but we are not associating those cameras to use by facial recognition. We do not own the software in order to conduct that type of video processing. And then, I'm sorry, your second part of your question?
Microphones, do they include microphones?
Understood. No, the cameras that we have now, Mr. Vice Mayor, do not record. They are video only. There is no audio associated with the cameras.
And it's the same for the ones we would purchase?
Mr. Vice Mayor, that's correct. We've never had any cameras that would record audio since we began the program.
All right. And so next couple of questions is, what are the policies that direct the use of the cameras and who has access to them? What happens if someone is found to be abusing the cameras for personal or political purposes? And then question related to this, we all know our police department is currently being investigated by DOJ for potential civil rights violations. How will we ensure that the camera system respects civil and constitutional rights of our residents? And how do we ensure the camera usage is not used in any biased manner? Like, monitoring political protests or non-political events.
Mr. Vice Mayor, understood. The policy for the camera usage is laid out in the Homeland Defense Bureau's manual. And essentially, when we are supporting an event in the downtown area, the threat mitigation unit personnel that have access to the cameras and are most familiar with the technology and its application, as well as the installation, are the ones that would have the access to the cameras to either change views, zero in or pan, tilt, zoom, whatever was necessary when we're actively monitoring an event. As mentioned earlier, the central monitoring station employees would have access to some of the other cameras that have been permanently mounted in the downtown area, and that's as part of the city's infrastructure protection unit. So they would have the access to those. If, as far as the abuse of those cameras, for the threat mitigation unit, those cameras are typically only used or accessed in an ongoing basis if we're actively managing a specific event. Once the cameras are installed in the downtown area, should there be an incident or some sort of a response by police to an active investigation, then we would have the ability to take a look at those cameras to see if there was anything evidentiary in nature that may or may not have been captured on those cameras. And if so, then it would be impounded as evidence as indicated by our digital forensic imaging unit. So if an employee were to be found abusing the cameras or using them for a non-law enforcement use, that would be an issue that would be investigated administratively within our department. And again, depending on the findings of that would be something our Professional Standards Bureau would have to investigate. These cameras are used for law enforcement purposes only. And again, it's either actively monitoring event or to ensure critical infrastructure protection. And as far as ensuring civil or constitutional access to the cameras or protection of that for citizens, those cameras that are currently installed are installed in public spaces only. They are not installed inside private businesses. They are only capturing common spaces where we expect to see large groups of people or where it would pose a threat should a vehicle pull up in front of a building where it's not supposed to be. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, it just a little more on that. I mean, and we're being investigated for potential civil rights violations or First Amendment violations. And I guess the root of my question is, what do we have a system of checks and balances that exist for the cameras to ensure that there is no abuse or bias, especially in a time where we've seen what's been put out in the media, and obviously what the DOJ is investigating. So, one, do we currently have a system of checks and balances? And because we are under investigation, are you, if this gets approved, are you looking at ways of making sure that no abuse or bias happens?
Mr. Vice Mayor, currently, as indicated, we do have department policies in place, as well as Bureau manual policies. Number one, the Bureau manual policy, as described, would cover the use and the access by Homeland Defense Bureau Threat Mitigation Unit employees. The department's policy regarding abuse of technology or equipment, again, would be investigated by our Professional Standards Bureau should there be an allegation of misuse or any type of subsequent investigations that's attached to that. With regard to the DOJ investigation, we are still following and complying with any and all requests for providing imagery or video or policies and anything associated with that investigation as required.
Okay, and then last question is, does there need to be any council approval to make any future decisions about the expansion of the use of the cameras, or who has access footage? Who gets to decide that? I know it's written in the Homeland Security Manual. Who decides what's written on there, or is there other policy changes that we must make as a council to change things?
Mr. Vice Mayor, at this time, I don't know that I'd be able to give you a detailed answer on that. I will tell you that if there were changes that were different than what our current policies are, it would be reviewed internally, and then it would probably be pushed up through our chain of command for further discussion. And if necessary, it's possible it could end up back here before you folks, before this subcommittee for review. But at this point right now, I don't know what those changes might be, so I really can't give you a specific as to what those changes might look like and who may need to review it.
Okay, so, and I don't know if you were around or not when the last or the initial cameras were installed. Was there a need for policy from council, or was it just a decision by PD, and our decision was solely to provide the fund or agree with the funding rather than the actual policy? Did council have anything to do with setting the initial policy?
Mr. Vice Mayor, at this time, I don't know. That was done back in 2008, I believe, and I was not within the unit, but I can certainly find out that answer for you and report back to the subcommittee.
Thank you. No other questions, Chairwoman.
Thank you. I just want to clarify, if there is not an event, are the cameras being monitored?
Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee, for the cameras that are installed on various buildings that help support either the point-to-point system or for cameras that are placed on key locations for protection of critical infrastructure sites, those cameras would constantly be recording, again, and they would be subject to the 30-day purge because of the storage. So if nothing happened within that 30-day period, then they would be rewritten over on the servers, and that way we can maintain continuous coverage.
Okay. And besides the Super Bowl coming to us in just a few short months, what other large-scale events do we have coming to downtown Phoenix?
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, the next subsequent event of similar size would be the NCAA Final Four tournament that would be coming the following year in 2024.
Excellent. All right, are there any other questions or discussion? Do we have a motion for approval?
Move to approve.
Second.
Second. Thank you. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed?
Nay.
We have a 3-1 vote for approval. Thank you, Assistant Chief and Commander. Appreciate your time with us today. Our next item is our Phoenix Police Department Hiring and Recruitment Monthly Report. We have Chief Williams, Assistant Chief Kurtenbach, and Director Amber Williamson with us this morning. This item is for information and discussion.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, Chairwoman, members of the subcommittee. I'm Mike Kurtenbach, Executive Assistant Chief of the Phoenix Police Department. Joining me virtually will be Budget and Research Director Amber Williamson. I will kick off today's presentation, and my portion of the presentation will refresh you on current staffing levels in the department, staffing trends, and emergency calls for service, as well as response times. I want to begin talking about total sworn staffing on the Phoenix Police Department, understanding that we can't do our jobs without our civilian professional staff, but the purpose of today's discussion is specific to sworn. So you may recall in the October 13th meeting, I updated you and said at that time we had 2,781 sworn filled positions on the department. I also indicated that we were losing on average 21 officers per month. If you look at this stat and you see we're down to 2,775, you might be encouraged by that. The reality is that between the last meeting and today's meeting, we graduated an academy class of 22 officers that are factored in there. So while we graduated 22, we lost 28 during that time to get us down to the 2,775 where we sit today. We have 17 police recruits that are currently in the academy. That class is not scheduled to graduate until December 10th of 2022, and we are currently striving to staff another academy class that will start in December. As of this moment, we have 13 pre-hires for that class, and we're attempting to process up to 10 more for that particular class. So if you take the 2,775 and you add the 17, that gets us to the 2,792 filled positions that you have there. But just a note that from day one of the police academy until we get an officer become solo capable, complete all of their academy training, do their field training, that takes approximately 43 weeks. So the 17 is a little bit of a misnomer. Also, it's important to note that of that 2,775, as of today, 185 positions are unavailable. So they are in transitional duty, they're accommodated, medical leave, military, whatever the case may be. So I don't want there to be an illusion that we actually have 2,775 uniformed officers or detectives that are providing service as of today. Shifting over to patrol staffing, you may recall that our minimum...
Can I ask a question, Madam Chair?
Yes, Councilman Ware.
So I apologize. So we get two different sort of handouts, if you will. We get the one that you're looking at on your screen right now. It's page 3 of that handout, and we got that, I think, last night. But in our packet, we get a different handout. And I'm trying to reconcile the two handouts or packets. So on page 17 of the packet that was in, looks like this, that I was sent probably end of last week, it says we have 2,823 total filled sworn. But then, obviously, on what we're looking at right here, it says we've got 2,775 filled sworn. So is the difference the number of officers who have left? Is that the net? I know you talked about the people graduate from the academy in this interim period. Can you explain why these numbers aren't the same? I assume some of it's just timing, but.
Yes, Madam Chairwoman, Councilman Waring, thank you for that question. So the budget and research numbers that you see, those are point-in-time numbers. What I provided to you is as of today. So we have a very robust system, my staff in the chief's office, that are tracking literally daily the amount of staff that we have, who we're losing, if somebody submits a retirement or a resignation memo. So my numbers are real time, whereas the numbers that come from budget and research are point-in-time numbers that are lagging ever so slightly.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Am I accurate to say then that so since the budget and research numbers, maybe you don't have this in front of you, I guess I just assumed that you would get this as well. It said September total filled sworn, and keep in mind in January it was 2949 on their sheet. Now it's down to 2823. So it dropped 126 over the course of 9 full months. But then I assume this ended September 30th, although it doesn't say that, it just says September. And now your thing is dated November 2nd. So it looks like we lost another 48 officers in the interim net. Then you'd add back in the 17 police recruits. So you lost 100 and whatever I just said, 126 over the first 9 months of the year. But in the last 32, 33 days, it sounds like you lost another 48 net. So it's ramping up. I mean, that's a faster attrition rate. In 1 month, you lost 48 officers. I'm just trying to, that's an accurate statement, correct?
So, Madam Chair, Councilman Waring, yes, we are losing officers at an accelerated rate. And again, the difference is those reports from Budget and Research, they have to take that moment in time,
right,
whereas I'm able to track daily.
Right. Yeah, I understand. I'm just saying. I assume both numbers are correct. I suppose they might not be, but I'm assuming that that's just kind of shocking. We're losing more than an officer a day, or less, losing about an officer and a half a day in the last month. Very worrisome, to say the least. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Please continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Continuing with patrol staffing, the backbone of the department, our minimum patrol staffing number is set at 1,096 officers. To refresh your memory, that's based on that 7-part resource allocation formula that I discussed last month that is weighted heavily on citizen-generated calls for service. That's our bread and butter, responding to calls when our citizens pick up the phone. Presently, we're operating at 51 below minimum staffing in patrol. That's that 1,045 number. We do have 36 officers in training. And again, because they are not solo capable officers, we don't factor them into that 1045 number. And of that total 185 that we show that are unavailable, 92 of those, so roughly half, are in patrol. Talking about staffing trends, and Councilman Waring, this will go into greater detail about what we just discussed. So January through October, we saw 212 total separations. And then we have to ask ourselves why people are leaving the department. In years past, DROP was that driver that would keep officers here for a full 5 years at least, so we could more accurately forecast separations from the organization. But 89 of the 212 were in DROP. That's a very low number. That's only 42%. And then 48 of those that were in DROP, or 54%, left prior to completing their DROP. That just didn't used to happen. What you see here is we have 250 known separations to the end of December. That's factoring what we've lost now to what we know until the end of the year. Actually, I had my staff refresh it this morning. We're up to 254 is what will be known between now and the end of the year, with 50% of those coming from patrol. And interestingly, again, we're seeing roughly a third of those that are resigning before they're becoming even retirement eligible. So they're not leaving with a retirement even at 50% at the requisite time. Digging a little bit more
Madam Chair, can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead, Councilman.
Thank you. Thanks, Chief. I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but I want to make sure I understand. We kind of touched on this last time, but I want to make sure it's clear. I guess it'd be the left side, the January, October statistics that you just went over. 48 officers basically paid to not go to work for us. It costs them a lot of money to quit DROP before they actually complete the 5 years, correct? And the third resigning before they're retirement eligible, they're leaving a fortune on the table, effectively, correct?
Yes, sir. As we discussed last month, the back end of DROP, that final year, those final 2 years tend to be the most lucrative, and depending what position you have, you could quite literally be leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table.
That might be the most worrisome sign of all of this, is that people would rather do that, and people who presumably aren't, fabulously wealthy. I suppose maybe there's a couple people like that who are still officers, but I suspect that most really probably could have used that money. We're always counting on that money, and we've made it so untenable, or circumstances made it so untenable that they'd rather leave. If that doesn't define crisis, I don't know what does. Thank you for answering my question.
Madam Chair.
Please continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Continuing on, talking about the first 3 months, the first quarter of this fiscal year, it's important to note who's separating from the organization. So we had 94 total separations, with just under a third coming from officers that have less than 5 years. So you may recall that we started hiring again in March of 15. So these are our most junior officers that have been hired most recently. So 30 of those had less than 5 years of experience, and of those, 18 had less than 3 years of experience. So they're not staying the way I have here for over 31 years, or those that have gotten into this profession as a calling. They're choosing to leave. Only 41 of those were in drop, and going back to what Councilman Waring and I just talked about, 21 left drop early, with an average of only 2.9 years. So they're leaving a little bit over 2 years, with a little over 2 years of drop left on the table. And then I'd like to talk about the workload that our patrol officers are facing. And it's important to note, Chief Williams and I are both incredibly proud of the work, the commitment, the dedication, the professionalism by our officers, all of our officers. This is specific to our officers in patrol. So as you see, last year they responded to a little over 123,000 emergency calls for service. Emergency calls for service are those priority one calls, those emergency calls. Those of you that have been in a patrol car, you've listened to a scanner, that's when you hear that tone. That means that a crime is happening now. Something is happening to someone and we need to get there quickly. So while that was a big number last year, as you factor in these last few weeks of 2021, we're on pace to have 11,000 more emergency calls for service. Breaking that down a little further, that's a little over 223 more emergency calls per week, or 31 calls per day. That's up over 9% over last year. In last month, I had mentioned that our median response time had gone up 22 seconds over 2020. We're now up 25 seconds over 2020. In talking about the great work that our officers do in these emergency calls, I just want to frame for a minute 2 of those calls that happened just last week. You may have seen one of them on our social media page, where some of our neighborhood enforcement team officers responded to an emergency call for service of a subject with a gun, and one of our officers was met with gunfire. If you saw the body-worn camera video, the round that was fired by the suspect entered the officer's vehicle just above the officer's head. By the grace of God, he was not hit. Our officers did not return fire, and we were able to take that suspect into custody. That was on November 3rd. On November 6th, in the Maryville Estrella Mountain Precinct, officers responded at 03:32 in the morning to a call for service of a subject who was in his backyard, inside his house, and in his front yard shooting a gun indiscriminately. When our officers got there, they were met with gunfire for approximately 20 minutes, at least one round striking a police Tahoe that our officers were hiding behind. Fortunately, that ended without any use of force by our officers, as they were able to use less lethal means to take that suspect into custody. I'm not trying to say that every call is that call, but these are the types of emergency calls that our officers are going to and they're addressing each and every day. That concludes.
Can I ask a question, Madam Chair? Sorry for interrupting again. So you got a lot more calls, you got fewer officers. What are you doing to, I don't want to say paper that over, but how are you redeploying the forces that you do have to get them to these extra calls?
So, Madam Chairwoman, Councilman Waring, we're trying to do a lot of things to address this issue. There's nothing I can do that can ensure the safety of our officers. I can just do my best to maximize the opportunity that they go home safely, while also providing professional service to our community. So we've discussed this in the past. Rebids and reorganizations are very disruptive. While we may get there, we're trying to avoid that if at all possible. So what we did starting back in July was send specialty to patrol. You may have heard that term. That's where in our 4 busiest police precincts, 4 days a week, we are sending 8 specialty detail officers, usually detectives, and a sergeant to those precincts to help patrol with calls for service. We're also providing supplemental overtime in those precincts to backfill holes where those vacancies occur. Those 51 under minimum staffing that I just talked about, we recognize that those are 51 that aren't coming to work at all. And then there are other officers that are allowed to take vacation. People get sick for whatever reason, they don't come to work. So we're empowering the respective chains of commands, the commanders, the shift lieutenants, and the sergeants to call people in, those that are scheduled and unscheduled, to ensure that we can at least meet minimum staffing. What we're doing now, by and large, is having patrol address patrol. There'll be an item that will be coming before formal on November 17th, asking for permission to buy body-worn cameras for those members of the department that don't have them today. The reason that's important, other than transparency, is we require our officers to deploy, if they deploy in this uniform, if they deploy in an enforcement capacity, to wear a body-worn camera. That will allow us to open up supplemental overtime opportunities to the entire department, not just patrol. So we think that will at least be helpful. Also on November 17th, there's going to be an item before formal that will ask for the formal adoption of a police civilian investigator. This would be something that would allow us to bring retirees back to support an investigation, or investigations, and the investigations division in particular, so that I can keep detectives. Think of homicide detectives, for example. I need a homicide detective to respond to the scene. One of those detectives is going to serve as the case agent. Then I'm going to need somebody who is going to actually be the scene agent. And I need interviews done of witnesses, of suspects, whatever the case may be. They're going to have to go out on the street. But there are things that can be done back in the office that we're hoping that those police civilian investigators will accomplish, that will lighten the load of our detectives who are out there actually doing the job every day. And then we're looking at other ways, other innovative ways, to bring more civilians into the fold, such as what was approved by the council in this last budget cycle, civilianizing the central booking detail, which allows me to take those uniformed sworn officers and reassign them throughout the organization. That's what we're trying to do in the short term to address the staffing challenges that we're facing.
Madam Chair, if I could follow up. So I'll just take the example I know best, the city's human trafficking task force. So if you had detectives working a big case in human trafficking, but you really have to have, and they're working that 24/7, but you really have to have minimal staffing, like what happens? I mean, but does the case get put on hold? I mean, how do you adjust for that? Because I'm sure pretty much all the things those investigators are doing are probably pretty important, but it's also important to answer the calls. I mean, how do you balance that? Or is it possible?
So, Madam Chair, Councilman Waring, that balancing act is very delicate, to your point. You may recall that at last month's Public Safety and Justice Subcommittee meeting, Chief Williams started off by talking about core mission and core function. And we have mission critical duties. And those are those positions that we have to staff. Right now, we are able to staff, not at a level that I would like or that I'm extremely comfortable with, all positions within the organization. To your point, sir, if we continue to lose sworn staff at the rate we're losing, or to be quite candid, if we even stopped losing right now, just as calls for service are going up, violent crime is going up, response times are going up, at some point we're going to have to seriously look at redeploying resources that already exist if we can't bring new officers through the door, through the means that I mentioned before. But ultimately, we have to meet those core missions, those mission critical duties. That's where we must invest our resources.
So the previous item on our agenda was about the cameras and so forth. It talked about the big events that are hosted in Phoenix. Obviously, just because there's a big event in downtown Phoenix, even if it's the Super Bowl, that doesn't necessarily mean life doesn't go on at Tatum and Bell or something, 20 miles away. I mean, are we going to have enough officers to make all of that work? I mean, I know you have the cameras and you're going to have the supplemental stuff and so forth. I guess my point is, the activities that you're talking about engaging in, getting more civilians deployed, former officers deployed, et cetera, that's as good a target as any to assume that things are going to continue to deteriorate unless all of a sudden people start applying to the academy. It just seems like you're still going to have traffic stops and stuff all around the city that aren't downtown at a concert or something. I assume plans are underway to address our staffing shortages in conjunction with the 2 monster events that we have coming up in the next couple of years. I assume that's happening. Is that correct?
Madam Chairwoman, Councilman Waring, that is a correct assumption. As I've mentioned to you, I've been here for over 31 years, 5 years in my position as the executive officer. Going back to when we opened up the Estrella Mountain and Black Mountain precincts in 2010, that led to a patrol-wide reorganization. We had to rebid in 2013, January of 2013. In 2014, we consolidated the Estrella Mountain and Maryville precincts into one. We went from an 8-precinct to a 7-precinct configuration. We eliminated 18 patrol squads at that time, and we reallocated resources so that we could ensure that we had an adequate number of first responders on those calls. Again, I can never guarantee safety. All I can do is my best to maximize the safety of those officers while getting them out to those calls that come from our citizens. And then in 2017, you may recall, one of the first things that Chief Williamson and I did in our new roles was identify positions outside of patrol and reallocate them to patrol to ensure that we had enough first responders. There's a cost to doing that, to your point, because they have to come from somewhere. And every job that our employees do is valuable. But ultimately, we have to decide which jobs are more important. So to very specifically answer your question, it would be irresponsible for us, and I'm not an irresponsible individual, to sit here and just hope things get better. I use data, I use trend analysis, I use fact patterns to make informed decisions. And what the data tells us is that if we continue at our current rate, that just 5 months from now, we'll have 100 fewer officers at least on the department. And if we continue at our same pattern, at our same rate, then 50 of those will come from patrol. So that's why we are doing our best to fill the holes as we are filling them. But the reality is, if we continue to lose the way we are losing sworn, and I mentioned to you that these next few weeks are going to be very critical for us because of inquiries that were made to Nationwide and appointments to the retirement office. If, and it's a very personal decision for our employees, they choose to leave this organization and go elsewhere or just retire or resign, then we'll have to make very hard decisions about where we put our employees.
If I can ask a question, because I know you've touched on it before. So if I was on patrol and then I got promoted and I was a detective and I had a specialty and I liked my job, I had no intention of retiring, I assume you're going to take into account, if we put such a person who's potentially retirement eligible back into patrol, which they maybe feel like I'm not diminishing any activities that you engage in, but some people might think, well, I did that. I did my time in that. Now I'm doing something else. I don't necessarily want to go back to doing that. We don't want to inadvertently force more people into retiring because they feel like, I'd like to stay, but so I'm sure you're taking that into account, but certainly at least I personally, Madam Chair, would like to hear if there's feedback like that. I'm sure you wouldn't continue with those policies, but that, as I'm sure you're aware, is probably a tricky needle to thread.
Madam Chair, Councilman Waring, you're absolutely correct. In the time that I've been on the department, I've made a lot of friendships, a lot of acquaintances, and people reach out to me daily. And I ask that. I solicit that feedback, just as Chief Williams and the other commanders, administrators, and the execs do. But talking about me personally, as I talk to detectives who have earned their position, so we all start in patrol. We all start in a blue suit. For me personally, I worked nights. They worked when my kids were young, my now 30 and 29-year-old children. I worked nights because I could take care of them during the day. And then when I earned the opportunity to secure a specialty position, that was something that also worked for my family. And I'm very mindful of the fact that there is life outside of this uniform. There is life outside of this badge and this profession. And it isn't just a generational thing. Although we have younger officers who are much more focused on a work-life balance than perhaps I was in my generation, I recognize that somebody works for an assignment that they're very proud of. We develop skills in that individual that allow them to be effective in that assignment. Let's say it's as a detective, as a special assignments unit officer, as a trainer down at the academy, whatever the case may be. And then if we say, okay, your job isn't as important as another job, and I'm going to take you now, and now you're not going to have control over your schedule. The very thing that you're talking about may very well happen, that we accelerate separations from the organization, which is why we're doing everything in our power to avoid getting to that point. But I will always be very candid, and I will always be very factual. If we reach that tipping point, we will have no choice but to reallocate, just as we did in 2014, just as we did in 2017. I'm hoping that we won't get there. On our current trajectory, we may very well be faced with that. But you are absolutely correct that our officers, they seek the assignments that they find gratifying. They seek work hours and days that are good for them and for their families. And specifically with regard to retirement eligible people, we already see that those that are in drop are leaving on average 2.1 years early. And we also saw by the data that you don't necessarily have to be in drop to leave. Those that the 30 of the 94 in the first 3 months that left with 5 years or less of service, 18 with 3 years or less of service. That is a significant consideration of ours. Also, it's important that you know, not only do I talk to officers individually, but we have focus groups where I have the opportunity to talk. And when I say officers, I'm talking to officers, I'm talking to sergeants, I'm talking to lieutenants. I already have access to the command and the exec staff because I want to hear from them in an unfiltered way. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? What can we do better? Because collectively, we're in this all together. Otherwise, it's going to get significantly worse before that pendulum swings back and it does get better.
Madam Chair, I'll just finish with this. I'm gratified, as I suspected I would be, but I'm gratified to hear what you say about soliciting input and so forth, because you talked about earned, much like the military. You know, you do better on the tests, you do better on the promotions, you get to maybe pick your spot a little bit more and then specialize. And I'm assuming older officers are much more likely than younger officers to have their pick of what they want to be doing all day long. And we've all, I'm sure every person who's watching this, whether in the audience or the council, we've all had, you know, maybe a boss we didn't like or a job we didn't like. And that's what I tell my kids. They're 11, but I tell them, you know, you better be doing something you like all day because you're going to be at work a lot more than you're going to be at home. So try to find something that you like to do and you get, you know, sort of a psychic reward from and you feel validated by. So I just, if you take that away from people who have already earned it, that would be a devastating blow. So it'd be much better to have people do that on sort of a either volunteer basis or a could you help us out basis and it's an order. Because I just think if you make the older officers do stuff that they just don't want to do, they're going to, I mean, it sounds like some of them already are anyway, but the ones who aren't leaving are going to pack it in. That's my fear, and it's going to exacerbate an already bad situation. It sounds like you're on it. You didn't need any of this probably from me, but those are concerns I have, and I appreciate you doing the best you can to address those going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Please continue, Chief.
And Madam Chairwoman and Councilman, if I just may, I am unapologetic in asserting that the Phoenix Police Department is the best department in the nation. Do we have our issues? Of course we do. So long as we're required to recruit from the human race, we are going to be fallible. But the men and women who do this job proudly. And to your point, those positions that they've earned, we want them to use those skills to the best of their ability to serve this community, the community that I was born in, the community that I raised my children in and I continue to live in by choice. We want to do that. Ultimately, we have a mission and we have a job that we have to do. And everybody who does this, who took that oath of office, understands that. And that's why that collective wisdom is so important. But trends being what they are, we're going to be forced to make decisions down the road, assuming it doesn't turn around. But to your point, sir, we are asking for volunteers to fill these holes. to seek opportunities to keep people in their positions as long as possible, because employee morale is critically important, their wellness is critically important, and ensuring that we can have a robust workforce is critically important. So with that, I'm going to turn the next portion of the presentation over to Budget and Research Director Amber Williamson.
Thank you, Chief. Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, I'm going to be discussing police sworn staffing comparisons. I'll go over a 10-year history of sworn staffing levels. I'll also briefly discuss a survey that my department did, looking at sworn counts per 1,000 residents, comparing Phoenix to other cities. And I'll also talk about a history of calls for service and response times over 10 years, which will demonstrate both of these measures have been increasing over the past decade. Next slide. So the current sworn police hiring target is 3,125 positions. This represents the number of sustainable positions in the current year general fund and public safety specialty funds budget. The chart on the screen provides population, number of filled positions, as well as a filled sworn per 1,000 resident ratio going back to fiscal year 11-12. I'd like to call your attention to the yellow highlighted row. As you can see, over the past 10 years, population in Phoenix has increased by 12.8%. while the number of filled sworn positions over this time has declined by 4.3%, from 3,032 positions in 11-12 to 2,901 in fiscal year 2021. The filled sworn per 1,000 ratio has also declined by roughly 15.2%. That bottom row of the chart provides the year-to-date through September data. The number of filled positions was 2,823, which you can see is just below that hiring target of 3,125. As I'd like to point out, Councilman Waring, as Chief Kurtenbach had indicated, we are providing a point-in-time sworn count on our budget and research reports, so it can differ from the real-time information that Chief Kurtenbach is providing. I just wanted to clarify that. Next slide.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question about this chart? There's a lot of talk about defund police and so forth. The City of Phoenix hasn't actually done that. It's unfortunately happening a little bit just kind of on its own with these numbers that we've been seeing in this presentation. But I think Chief Kurtenbach's number, Amber, differed from you. I'm sure you probably were watching earlier. I think it's 27 to 75. And check me if I'm wrong, but authorized spots with the 3,125. So you got about 350 officers we could hire tomorrow if they applied to go to the academy. To the point I was making earlier to Chief Kurtenbach, a detective, though, if somebody graduates from the academy, they don't automatically all of a sudden become a detective. There's years of experience, testing, and so forth. So those are even harder to replace. It's just you need time and grade and so forth to learn the job and move up, like many jobs anyway. But the City of Phoenix, the City Council, the city staff sent a message that we should have at least 3,125 officers, and we've only got 2,775. That should be concerning to everybody. So it's not for necessarily a lack of trying budget-wise, and we got to find a way to get at least 350 people to apply for these open spots. So if you are listening, which is part of the reason I brought this up, there is opportunity in the Phoenix Police Department to step right in. Please apply. But I think there's probably a misperception out there that maybe this was some plan to lower this number, and that's actually not true given, what the budget numbers are, correct? I mean, we have the financial capacity to make this happen. I guess, and maybe that's not a question for this presentation, but of course that would seem at least to leave money that would have gone to these extra 350 people that's available maybe to potentially redeploy with the current officers for retention or hiring bonuses or something like that. If that's inappropriate for this discussion, maybe it could be on an agenda for another discussion, Madam Chair, in the future about how we can use that, because we only got 17 applicants right this second in the academy. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Councilman Waring, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. So I'll continue with the presentation. Next slide, please. So Budget and Research staff conducted a survey comparing sworn staffing levels per 1,000 in population. We looked at our standard list of survey cities, the top 10 cities by population, and then also local Arizona cities. I do want to mention there are some caveats to this because there's unique characteristics in each police department in each city that make apples to apples comparisons a little difficult. It doesn't mean the survey results aren't relevant. They are. I just want to mention these caveats. For example, there are differences amongst police departments in terms of the geographic size or number of square miles that police is responsible for responding to. There are also differences in population and density, as well as demographics, differences in types of calls for service and crime rates, and then also sworn deployment and delivery models. So for example, if a police department chooses to spend more of its or have more of its sworn personnel respond and patrol, that's not to be likened to other cities. Some cities can deploy their officers in different ways, and that can have an effect on certain measures such as response time. Next slide. So first we'll start with our standard list of survey cities. You can see that Phoenix's hiring target and our filled count is highlighted in the darker blue rows. When we look at our hiring target of 3,125, we're just slightly above the median with a sworn personnel ratio to 1,000 residents of 1.89. However, we do drop below the median. We look at our filled count as of the end of 2021, which was 2,901. Next slide.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I'm sure you're sick of me, but can I make a point to this slide that pertains to my district, but the city as a whole? I'm guessing, I've been to most of these cities. I'm assuming we are physically, geographically bigger than most of the cities on this list. That's my guess. We're a physically big city, take out population. So our 1.6 per 1,000 has to cover a lot more miles than maybe somebody in Oklahoma City. I don't know if you've looked at it that way, but it's just something to bear in mind. My district is particularly like that, where it's really spread out. So if you put 20 officers up there versus 20 officers downtown, or maybe 20 officers in Kansas City, Missouri, those aren't equivalent things in terms of response time. Is that a fair analysis, Amber? Not the specific examples I used, but
Correct.
the theory behind them.
Yes. So Madam Chair, Councilman Waring, members of the subcommittee, that's correct. That's why I mentioned those caveats, because a city like New York, for example, or even Philadelphia, is quite different from a geographical size of Phoenix. So it does take sworn personnel longer to get to a call for service. And that's why I wanted to mention that. Correct. Okay, so next slide. So now looking at our top 10 cities by population, you can see for Phoenix, both our hiring target and the filled count is below the median, trailing Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Houston in terms of our sworn per 1,000 resident ratio. Next slide. When we look at our local Arizona cities, we are at the top in terms of our hiring target. However, as our filled count, which has dropped since the end of 2021, we were below Tempe. Next slide. Now I'll cover calls for service and response times over the same 10-year period. The first column, is the number of calls for service. This represents all calls that come into 911 dispatch from citizen-initiated calls. The next column is the number of calls per filled sworn personnel. And then the last column on the right is the response time. As you can see in the first column, drawing your attention again to that yellow highlighted row, the number of calls for service over the past 10 years has increased by 3.2%. The number of calls per filled sworn personnel has also increased by 7.9%. And then the response time has grown from 5 minutes and 14 seconds in 11-12 to 6 minutes and 40 seconds in 2021. That represents an increase of 1 minute and 17 seconds. And that concludes my portion of the presentation. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Chief Kernbach to discuss next steps.
Thank you, Amber. Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. So just talking about those next steps, as she alluded to. So due to the staffing challenges, there's several things that we're trying to do. So first and foremost, we're trying to find innovative solutions to retain our officers. And we're going to get in greater detail with you at future meetings to talk about what those are, to present some ideas to you and to the council. And with regard to our recruitment efforts, we recognize that today's recruit tends to ingest information differently than when I came on, and we have to meet people where they are at throughout the country, not just locally. So we're utilizing social media literally and liberally. We're using radio, television ads, well-placed ads on recruitment websites. We're doing a combination of in-person and virtual recruiting events with community groups. We're using data to drive where we're investing our resources because we can see the number of clicks that there are on the websites where there's interest in coming to Phoenix. And quite frankly, we're getting to that time of year, particularly when you look to the Midwest and you look to the East, where we are a very attractive location for applicants. That's why we're recruiting outside of Arizona, using our joint Phoenix PD website, and also for applicants that are looking to apply and may struggle a little bit with the academic part. We've implemented these bi-monthly study groups to help them with their preparation. And you've seen our ads. You've seen it on 620 as well. Thanks to the mayor and the council, we have a $7,500 hiring incentive for our new applicants. That includes my presentation, and I'll take any additional questions that you may have.
Madam Chair, can I ask a couple of follow-ups?
Sure.
Unless somebody else, I've talked a lot, so if somebody else wants to go first, that's fine.
I haven't heard from anybody.
Okay. So based on what you said before, I guess I don't know that you gave a number of, Chief, of when you'd actually have to start doing some of the things that you're really trying not to do. But by my count, you're going to be down to about 2,600, 2,650 officers, pretty short order, jacking up the response times, increasing the number of calls for each officer. Is there a number? Because I've had citizens ask me, you've done some prep on that in the more academic sense, and some of that got out into the world. And people have asked me very directly, when is this going to happen if it's not happening right now? Is there a hard number, or you're hoping things turn around?
Madam Chair, Councilman Waring, absent hope, we're left with despair, so I will always be hopeful. With that said, there is not a hard number right now, and it goes back to what I mentioned. We are hoping that we can get officers of all ranks and all assignments that are willing to fill supplemental overtime positions in patrol. So we are hoping that we get that voluntary movement to those positions, which allow us to push that out farther. I'd mentioned that we're already using Specialty 2 Patrol, taking detectives and specialty detail officers out of their assignments 1 week a month, and we're sending them to patrol. I would be reticent to expand that because I talked last month about caseloads and duties that those employees already have. So I don't want to have unintended consequences. We're hopeful that we can maintain for as long as possible. But I'll say this when we talk about numbers. So at our peak, we had 3,388 filled sworn positions. At our lowest, we hit 2,677. That 2,677 came after 6 years and 2 months of not hiring. That number triggered that November of 2014 reorganization, where we went from 8 precincts to 7 precincts. So whereas we hope to use supplemental overtime to stave that off, we hope to hire civilian police investigators that can help lighten the workload. We hope to find other innovative and creative ways. To your very point, if we continue to lose officers at the rate that we are losing them, with the understanding that these next few weeks will be very telling, then we may be forced to make some very difficult decisions to reallocate employees from where they sit today to positions that are of greater need organizationally. Not to say their positions aren't important today, but those that meet that core mission.
And Madam Chair, Councilman
Can I
Waring,
also ask,
this is Lori.
Oh, sure.
I just wanted to add something to that, to answer your question, Councilman Waring. We are actively working on strategies to retain officers. We're actively working on recruitment, as Chief Kurtenbach outlined. We are not prepared to discuss the details of those strategies today. We will be prepared to discuss them further at next month's subcommittee meeting, and we will be briefing the council in preparation for those meetings. So not to put off the answer to your question, but we'd really like to come prepared and discuss it in more detail in a strategic fashion at the subcommittee meeting next month.
Yes, and to my earlier, thank you, Lori, and Madam Chair, to my earlier point, maybe that'll encompass the discussion of, since we're 350 people short, what happens to that money? How can that be redeployed to really help our citizens? Not the officers, obviously, and give them job satisfaction and make them want to stay or recruit new ones. But, also, how can we do that? And so it sounds like maybe Lori's going to answer some of the, maybe next month. Chief, how much of an issue, I mean, not every officer or any person in any organization shows up to work every single day without ever being sick or being injured. Obviously, it's one thing, the likelihood that, something is physically going to happen to me at work as a council person is different, or if I'm a teacher or whatever, is different than if I'm an officer chasing a murderer down the street. Obviously, the risk level is somewhat different, a more physical job, and sanitation workers, and there are a lot of folks who would, fall into that category. There's just more moving parts and more potential for physical injury. How many officers are out per day? How much of an issue is that? It's got to be more of an issue than some other jobs, I would think.
So, Madam Chair, Councilman Waring, that goes back to that number that I mentioned earlier. So, as of today, we have 185 officers who are unavailable for a variety of reasons throughout the organization, almost half of those being in patrol. And those are ones that we know that are out greater than 30 days. And that's an important distinction. So that's 30 days that somebody isn't going to be on a patrol squad, focusing on our first responders. But as you mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, people do get injured for less than 30 days. It can be an ankle, it could be a finger, it could be an elbow. There are parts that you can't see that get injured, and that's where I talk about employee wellness, where we need to take care of our employees, because PTSD is very real in things that our employees encounter every day, things that you can't prepare for, and that's why we have to invest in our employees. And people get sick. People are allowed to take vacation. That's where that supplemental overtime, there are the knowns. There are those folks that we know aren't going to be there, and we can strive, and we do, to backfill those positions. And then also maintaining a pool of officers that we can call in when we get somebody who developed a cold or is otherwise unavailable to come in, has child care issues, as any business. That's that struggle. But in terms of this profession, I say it's a calling. It is not the easiest job in the world, but I will say it's the most gratifying job I've had in my life.
I mean, you touch on the point, officers are going to get colds just like everybody else, and you don't necessarily want those folks coming to work and spreading it around to everybody else, particularly in the time of COVID and so forth. But, little known Waring family fact, I sprained my ankle badly running for this office. I stepped off a curb, didn't think it was bad. My ankle swelled up. I had to go to the doctor. I could hardly put on pants. It was so swollen. But you know what? I could keep knocking on doors because I could move at my own pace. I could still go to my day job. I mean, an officer wouldn't have been able to, just like an athlete, you couldn't go out and function with that ankle like that. So the same injury doesn't necessarily, or the same illness doesn't necessarily affect, I think it has a disproportionate impact on officers. So that's another complicating factor for your mission. I hope that this gets solved. The only way, though, that I can see to solve it, we touched on this last time. I can't tell you how many times people have told me, I don't know why so-and-so is running for office. They can't win. And I can't tell you how many times I responded, well, I don't disagree. I don't think they're going to win either. But it doesn't matter what I think, and it doesn't matter what you think. It only matters what the person running thinks, and they think they can, or they want to run, and so they're doing it. So whenever you're thinking about strategies, it's really would behoove all of us, and most of us on this call are older than probably our typical recruit, but you got to put yourself in the heads of a 22-year-old potential applicant and make it an attractive job. And so I don't know if there's some hiring expert or how you do that, but I don't know. I'll just boil it down to you and I, Chief. I think we're roughly the same age. I can remember what being 22 is like, but it's not, it's filtered by all that's happened since. We're maybe not the best two people to try to figure out how to talk to a 22-year-old. So I don't know if I don't know who you use to do your marketing campaigns and stuff, but I certainly hope that it's someone who's making the job more attractive than what's been produced, 17 applicants, when you know that there's at least 350 spots that are fillable today. I know everybody's having trouble hiring, so it's not just the Phoenix Police Department, but I hope you take my point. I'm not saying it in jest or lightly. Got to find a way to get in the heads of younger people and make them want to be police officers, and that's not something that can be forced. There are probably people out there who are mission driven, who maybe haven't thought about being police officers, just like we have to do as candidates, we have to identify voters who might be inclined to vote for us and then get them to turn out at the polls and so forth. It's really not any different than that. And it's also much easier said than done. So maybe we could talk about that as well at a subsequent meeting, like how you plan to address that, unless you've got something to say about it today.
Yes, Madam Chairwoman, Councilman Waring, the gray hair between the two of us is obviously very telling. And we've evolved as a department and certainly as a profession that police officers don't necessarily have all the answers. So that's why we're deferring to younger individuals inside and outside of law enforcement to help us connect with, I'll say, kids. As the father of my youngest is 29 years old. I don't know how that happened, by the way, but I have a 30-year-old and I have a 29-year-old. So I even try and pick their brains, but they are even years older than a lot of our applicants as well. Yeah. So we're trying to glean from, I sound old in saying this, the younger generation, how we can make this job as appealing to them. Recognizing that work-life balance is critically important to this younger applicant. The Police Executive Research Forum, I believe I touched upon this last month. They had a symposium the chief and I went to a while back where they had officers from 1 to 5 years come in. So not people with graying temples like myself, and tell us why they chose this profession. So building upon that, building our hiring and our recruitment strategies on that is how we believe we'll get more applicants through the door. But also the reality, and you know this, this isn't unique to law enforcement. We're seeing professions across the nation that for whatever reason are having difficulty recruiting and very challenging hiring decisions that are being made. But as the most visible form of government, when law enforcement isn't adequately staffed, that can have dire consequences and significant impacts. But we are seeking other ways to recruit, to bring folks into the door to do this job.
Thank you. I appreciate your feedback. I appreciate you indulging me, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Waring. Vice Mayor or Councilwoman Ansari?
Chairwoman, I think to Chief Kernbach, it's obvious it's not a lack of funding. It's obvious it's other things. And it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to solve them and get folks in the academy before we hit the numbers you're talking about. And so I think part of the conversation I'd like to hear next time is what are those things that we can take off of officers' plates? Because in having conversations with some officers and other folks, it is a lot of the things that maybe they didn't think they were going to be doing when they became an officer, whether it's the mental health stuff, whether it's, domestic violence, whatever those issues are that they might not be prepared for, that you often mention or others have mentioned, that maybe officers aren't the best folks to respond to those. I would like to have a serious conversation of what are the things we can take off of officers' plates and figure out other folks or other departments, or again, maybe, we're moving on with the CAP program or expanding the CAP program. What are ways in which we can do that? Seeing other cities even take traffic away from uniformed officers. I've seen other cities try different things. So I really want us to explore that. What I don't want is for us to continue to have the same conversation, which this conversation, is very similar to the one we've had at the last subcommittee. And so, yes, we can continue to sound an alarm. We can continue to kind of freak ourselves out, the public out. And I think it's warranted. I think people should be worried. But I think it's what are those solutions? What are those alternatives that we can make happen with what we have? Again, I think we've, as a council, tried to give you the tools as possible. And like you both and Jim have said, it's not just the Phoenix Police Department that's having trouble hiring folks. It's a lot of people. The world has changed since the pandemic. That's an added risk to being an officer. What does that look like? Just really wanting to get into the facts of why folks don't want to be officers. And I think that's when we differ in political opinions. But I do think we have to go deep into that, be real with ourselves, understand what the issues are, and really look for alternatives in the sense of taking things off of officers' plates. We've had to settle situations where an officer was dealing with a dog, or you know, we're making officers do all these things that they weren't set out to do, whether it's being a dog catcher or address mental health issues or other things. And so I'd really hope that our next conversation goes into those issues and not just what seems today like a repeat of our last conversation. Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I
Councilwoman,
may.
sorry. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Chief.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Vice Mayor, I wholeheartedly agree with you, and we've had this discussion multiple times. And that's one of the things I'm very grateful to the council to approving this partnership with Arizona State University last month, who is now endeavoring to look at those very calls for service that perhaps aren't best suited for a uniform to respond to. Recognizing that we have to be holistic in our approach to how we deploy the limited resources that we have. So that is something that will be coming forward in the very near future, I hope, through that partnership with ASU, so it isn't just cops saying that we shouldn't respond to this. This is an academic institution that is well respected, certainly in our community, saying what, or at least recommending calls that we shouldn't respond to, so hopefully that will help, and that will help further this discussion and will help us reshape our department and how we deploy.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Vice Mayor. Councilwoman Ansari.
Thank you, Chairwoman. First of all, just want to thank Chief Kurtenbach. I know you are under an immense amount of pressure, and I very much appreciate the commitment that you're putting towards this. And I know you and the entire department are working around the clock. I agree with the Vice Mayor. I think what we've seen is that we ask officers to do too much. It's not fair, the burden that's on them. And so I'm excited about this partnership with ASU because I think, of course, when it comes to violent crime and so many other issues, armed officers, our sworn positions are absolutely needed, but hopefully there are other ways. And I don't know the timeline on that ASU partnership, but I hope that we can identify those areas soon and maybe before the next budget cycle, see what we can improve. I also, as Councilman Waring said, I think even before the pandemic, the future of work is changing. There's countless studies about this and countless, every big company has completely changed the way they operate and the way they look for talent, but also retain talent and what they allow. So I think we really, really need to be innovative in not only our marketing strategies, but just how we make this job, which is very difficult, seem appealing to people when we are in a very different world. So I don't have the answer to that, but I just think, 2020 changed everything, but it was already changing far before that. So I appreciate the challenge, and I hope that next time we can look towards solutions. And even despite the difficulties, I am optimistic that we can figure it out. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman.
Thank you, Councilwoman Ansari. I appreciate, Chief, the additional information regarding our situation, however somber it is, and I am happy to hear, Lori, that you will be making a presentation at the December subcommittee meeting regarding next steps for this. I think at that time what I heard from my fellow committee members is that we'd like to know a little bit more about, and I realize the ASU study will help this, but what maybe are some of the things that can come off of the officers' plates. We have funded our positions. I do believe that, Chief, you would probably attest to the fact that we use that funding in overtime to try to pay our folks to fill our empty spots. But also Councilman Waring talked about how are we using our funding to maybe in recruitment or in marketing and those spotlights. And then maybe having a little bit more information, if we can, on the timeline on the ASU partnership, the study and when it will come to us. and I also hope that part of that presentation will address some of the, I think, concerns around morale as well. And as you have said several times, doing that work-life balance for this generation. I've even, in discussing it with some of our other departments, the fire department included, where our men and women they have a greater desire to have better work-life balance than maybe some of our previous generations did. So again, thank you so much, Chief and Amber, for presenting this information for us, and we certainly do look forward to hearing.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any additional comments, Chief? Are you good?
No, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. And with that, I believe we have worked our way through our agenda today. And do we have any public comments?
Chairwoman, we do not have any requests to speak.
Okay, and future agenda items?
Chairwoman?
Yes, sir.
I have one if that's okay right now.
Okay.
I'd want to request an update on the DOJ investigation. I know we're doing a website, but I think it would be prudent to have an update at the Public Safety and Justice Subcommittee. DOJ was clear that we shouldn't stunt any reform efforts or efforts to better the police department. They were very clear that we should continue to do those things, and so I'd appreciate it if we can get updates on changes being made at the subcommittee as well, on reforms or shifts that the police department may be making.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I think that given the magnitude of the Department of Justice investigation, that would be an item for full council to hear, not just our subcommittee. So I would defer to the full council agenda, to having it there. Any other requests? We would be adjourned at 11:21. Thank you.
Thank you.